We are collectively richer than we have ever been. This is not just a rich nation. This is an extraordinarily wealthy nation. We are wealthier. We, quote unquote, are wealthier than we ever have been. But the pronoun we is the interesting pronoun. Because the question is, who is we? And do we really feel like a we? Beginning in the late 1970s, if you look at what happened to wages of the typical worker, they started to flatten in the 1970s. Up until the 1970s, from 1946 right through 1978, wages for the typical American worker were rising quite rapidly in line with productivity gains. The economy was growing and everybody's income was growing. In fact, from 1946 to 1978, the economy doubled in size and everybody's income doubled. Just about everybody's, not everybody's, but just about everybody's. When I was a kid, my parents started out, remember we had a little secondhand car, and then we had a new car, and then we had a new car and a secondhand car, and we had a television, and then we had instead of an icebox, we had a refrigerator, and we traded up. Everybody was trading up, and the cars, I remember the fins on those cars, the fins got longer and longer every year, but there was an expectation of doing better and better, and it wasn't just buying more stuff. There was that, but it was also an expectation of widening prosperity in terms of standards of living going up. Healthcare. We invested in education. We invested in higher education. We had a public system of higher education in this country, particularly California, second to none. We had a K-12 system that kept on improving. In California, it was the best in the nation, and the nation had the best educational system, public educational system in the world. And we invested in roads. Does anybody remember the interstate highway building plan under Dwight Eisenhower? How did we pay for all of this? Well, the highest tax rate on the highest incomes in the 1950s under Dwight David Eisenhower, a Republican former general, not a socialist. The highest marginal income tax rate in the 1950s on the highest incomes was 91%. But even after you consider all deductions, all tax credits, it was still way higher than 50%. And we used those revenues and the revenues of an increasingly wealthy middle class to invest in education and in highways and bridges and in social services and in all kinds of things that we needed to do together. It was a virtuous cycle. And then in the late 70s, something happened. Wages began to flatten. In fact, if you were an hourly worker, and 80% of Americans were hourly workers, are still hourly workers, if you're an hourly worker, your actual wages started to drop, adjusted for inflation. And what did we do in response to that? Well, first of all, women, particularly middle class and working class women, poor women had already been in work, in paid work, but middle class women, young mothers, all went into the workforce in very large numbers, beginning in the late 1970s, early 1980s, in order to, it's not, I wish I could say it was because of all these wonderful professional opportunities open to women. That was part of it for some women, but most of the reason that women went into work in such large numbers, into paid work, was because of the declining wages in real terms of most middle class and working class men. And then the second coping mechanism by the 1990s was everybody working longer hours. I remember when I was Secretary of Labor looking at the data, and I was amazed at how many hours we were putting in. We were putting in, the typical American putting in more hours than the extraordinarily industrious Japanese. You had two parents, usually they were working shifts in terms of taking care of the kids. Very often they were working more than one job. I used to have an acronym for these couples. I called them DINS, D-I-N-S, double income no sex. And then our third coping mechanism, when those first two ones were basically exhausted, was to use our homes as piggy banks and to get all sorts of money out of our homes in terms of refinancing and using the homes as collateral for, and we did that starting about 8 years ago, 9 years ago, 10 years ago, and then of course we know how that ended. So all of those coping mechanisms are now exhausted. Now, the United States economy continued to grow. There was obviously a Great Recession, but if you look overall, the trajectory continued to grow. And certainly from 1970, late 70s, 1978, in the 80s, we kept on going like this. In the 1990s, we did very, very well, particularly when I was labor secretary. And then, and we kept on doing well until the Great Recession. But if the median wage is flat and many people's wages are actually dropping, what happened to all the money? Again, this is not a criticism. The fact of the matter is that the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1% became far, far, far wealthier. And that's where the question of we comes in, that pronoun we. Because the question fundamentally, it seems to me, is a question that Margaret Thatcher tried to address. And she came up with the wrong answer. The question was, what is a society? Margaret Thatcher, do you remember what she said? This goes back a way. She represented that notion, which Ronald Reagan and Ayn Rand and a lot of others at that time, and there's still, in fact, unfortunately, it's still very much with us. There is no such thing as a society. Well, if there's no such thing as a society, who's we? There is no we. And if there's no we, then what kind of responsibilities do we owe each other by virtue of being members of the same society? None, because there's no society of which we can be members. That seems to me one of the most dangerous doctrines ever enunciated, because it leads to a country, a neighborhood, a community, a state, where if you are doing well, you basically have no responsibility to anybody else. And if you are doing okay, you consider people who are not doing as well as you to be threats to you. And if you can possibly do it, you send your kids to private schools, you use private health clubs instead of public facilities and public parks. You privatize your own existence. You live in gated communities. You secede from the rest. And that is what, unfortunately, too often has been happening. So to me, the sign of a decent society is a society that takes care of those who need taking care of. A society that willingly and gladly pays the taxes that are necessary to support fundamental services. A society in which people feel that they do owe one another simply for being members of that same society. Loss of a job or illness could occur anywhere and could affect anyone. And we are all inevitably, invariably in the same boat. And a society in which the boats rise or fall together. Now, that's not the society, unfortunately, we are living in right now. The society I grew up in, and many of you who are early boomers also grew up in, was one where we remembered, because our parents actually were engaged in, we remembered World War II. We remembered indirectly the Great Depression. We remembered times when we were all in it together. when we all depended on each other. And the memory of that mutual interdependence has faded at precisely the same time as inequality has widened. And when you get a Supreme Court, I don't have to finish that sentence, do I? So you see, we had a virtuous cycle, and we now have, in many ways, a vicious cycle. Because we have people who are getting wealthier and wealthier who don't understand that they are part of the society. We have people under them who are very much afraid of losing their footing and consider the people under them to be their enemies. And we have unlimited political money, big money in politics, that's making it hard to do what we need done. And that is going to be the great challenge ahead. I am optimistic, and I'm going to end with this note of optimism because I have spread gloom and doom. Here's why I'm optimistic. Number one, every time historically, this country has faced a kind of gaping, widening gap between those who are doing well and everybody else. And it certainly was the case in the last Gilded Age, in the 1880s, 1890s. What did we do? We had a progressive era, starting in 1901, in which we created a progressive income tax. We had laws limiting corporate donations and contributions into politics. We had food and drug laws. We actually had antitrust laws. We broke up the giant trusts like the Standard Oil Trust. We, as a country, understood that the we, had a real significance. And we pulled together and we changed America. And we did the same thing in the 1930s. And we did the same thing to some extent in the 1960s in terms of civil rights and voting rights and Medicare. And we will inevitably reach that tipping point again because too many people understand that not only are we in the same boat together, but if we don't do it, the society comes apart. And that is bad for everyone. I was talking just this afternoon with the CEO of one of the biggest companies in America. And he said to me, I didn't say to him, he said to me, I'm worried about widening inequality. And I said, interesting, why are you worried? And he said, because my customers can't afford my products. When 95% of the economic gains since the recovery started in 2009 go to the top 1%, the vast middle class and working class and the poor cannot afford, don't have the purchasing power to keep the economy going. So this CEO of one of the biggest companies in America says to me, I'm concerned about widening inequality because my customers can't buy my products. Well, let me tell you, that's one of the most encouraging conversations I've had. So the worm is turning. We're going to get to a tipping point soon. And all of you, because of what you are doing and the assumed values that I assume you have because you wouldn't be here and you wouldn't be involved in adult day services if you did not share these values. You are on the front lines, but you're also on the cutting edge of the changes that will happen. So for that reason, and for the great work that all of you do, I want to thank you.